Alright, so today's tutorial should be fairly quick. What I want to talk about is just how you should go about adding in edge loops in order to keep the shape of your model. It's kind of a tricky thing to do, right? Because you need to add different edge loops in so that you don't completely lose your form, but at the same time you don't want to add too many and run into the issue of having this super high poly model, which might cause other issues for you. For the most part, I like to keep my models as low poly as possible. And then you want to add extra edge loops in certain spots that might be deforming. So if you're doing a human, think about where your joints are going to be, on your elbow, on your shoulder, on your kneecap. Areas like that, it's okay to add in some of those extra edge loops because it's going to help when your rig and your model starts to move around. But for other objects, you don't want to add them in just to add them. You want to keep things as simple as possible because it'll help making changes that much easier. So what we're going to do is create a very simple model using the Extrude tool. We'll duplicate it a few times and we'll just kind of look at the differences and a couple of different ways you can go about trying to smooth that thing out in an effective and economical way. So I need to create a cube first, so I'm just going to go into my perspective view. I'm going to hit spacebar, go to create, polygon primitives, and cube. Okay, so with my cube created, I'm going to add a couple of new subdivisions into it. So over in my inputs, I can click the polycube 1, and then for subdivisions width, height, and depth, I can just type in a 4. And we'll just kind of play around with 4 subdivisions for this today. All right, so what I want to model, the first thing that I'm going to do is just click R. I'm going to scale this down a little bit, like that. And it's my scale Y. I'm going to pull it up and just kind of rest it on top of my grid as if my grid were a floor. And just get this type of shape for right now. I'm also going to turn my wireframe on shaded on. So if you didn't see the previous tutorials, that's right here on this little menu bar. It's called wireframe on shaded. It's that blue cube with the outer ring, and that just helps us when I deselect kind of keep that topology so that we can see it. So I want to select my cube, right click, and go down to face. Then I'm going to extrude up a little bit of a model, I guess. So I'm going to select just the 4 interfaces on my top. And then from here, I'm going to hold down Shift and right click and go to Extrude Face. So with Extrude Face selected, I'm just going to pull my model up a little bit in a second, and then I want to start to work it from there. But the first thing I'm going to do is actually click this little blue circle with the line coming out of it. I want to click one of those scale options, and I'm going to scale my model down a little bit and just add those new faces in, actually right on flush with the rest of the model. Once that's in there, I can just click G, and G will do that exact tool that we had previously used. So in this instance, it was extrude because I just used extrude tool, and I just want to do it again. Now I can pull up my model a little bit here, and we'll just kind of form almost like a trophy in a way, just kind of form a little bit of a shape that's kind of coming out of the top of this cube. So I'll go till about here. I'll click G again and pull that up. And at this point, I'll start to go out a little bit. So you can click one of those scale options and then scale it from the middle. Click G again. And then let's go out a little bit more. So I'm going to pull it up. I'm going to click that scale option. I'm going to scale out even further. That looks good. We'll click G again. This time I'm just going to scale straight up. And then I'll click G just a few more times, go up a little bit more, and I'm going to scale it in now and kind of round the top of this out. And that should work. So it almost looks like a pawn, like a chess piece. So I can click Q, that'll get me out of my extrude tool, or I can right click and go to my object mode. and that will also get me out of my extrude tool. So we have this model here, and this is kind of the base model that we're going to leave alone, and we're going to reference back as we make some changes on some other models. But if you want to just see what it looks like smoothed out, you can use the shortcuts that are on your keyboard. So 1, if you press 1, that'll be the view that we're already in. And if you press 3, that's going to smooth this object. It's going to give you this little smooth preview, and it does a pretty nice job actually. You'll be able to see what this is going to look like when it would be smoothed out. So you can see how much that really changes, right? It really rounds everything out from these harder corners that we had. And even though it looks nice, what if in reality we did want some of those harder corners to still be in there, you know, especially on the bottom or on the top part right here in these larger faces. Maybe I don't want that to be as round, so what can I do to make it keep its form a little bit more? And that's what I want to talk about a little bit today. So I'm going to just duplicate this object. So if you select it and just hit Command D, that'll duplicate. You can click W and just pull it off to the side a little bit and keep it pretty close. Okay, so we've duplicated that first standard model, and now let's make a couple of changes to it. What I'm going to do is add some edge loops in, and let's see what it looks like when we start to add extra edge loops onto our shape. So right now this thing's pretty low poly, right? We haven't done anything to it yet. So there's still a lot of changes to be made. What I'm going to do is select it. I'm going to hold down Shift and right click and go to my Insert Edge Loop tool, which we talked about in the previous tutorial. In the Insert Edge Loop tool, I want to put a couple of edge loops around some of the spots that I want to keep my form. So let's just say that I wanted to keep my form around the border on the kind of the base of my object here. So how can we do that? Well, let me just put a couple of edge loops that wrap around the side. So I'm going to put one here, which is going to kind of tuck into that corner. And then I'll put one going the same way, the other side. And then I'll just do the back. So I'm going to put one going across. And then you want to go over. Oop, that's the wrong one. And then put one right here as well. So I added in 4 new edge loops onto my model. And let me just highlight them so you can see it. If you ever just double click on any of your edges, it'll highlight the entire loop. So these are the 4 edges that I just added in, or these new edge loops. This model's still pretty low poly, right? We didn't do much to it, but we'll see what kind of difference it makes and if it makes any difference when we try and smooth it out. But just by adding in an edge loop that kind of wrapped around each of the corners and helped out here, it should make a little bit of a difference. So if I go to my first model, go to my object mode, select it and click 3, and I'm going to rename this base. And then I go to my newer model and I click 3. You can really start to see the difference between the two. So if you just look at the border wrapping around the bottom, it's a lot, kind of a harder border than this rounded out corner that we had on our base model. And that was only by adding 4 new edge loops in. So we didn't do much, but we were able to really start to keep this shape because we wanted this to have that harder edge. And now it does. It looks a little bit better. Yeah, it's still a little rounded out, don't get me wrong. But compared to what we had before, we're definitely on the right track. And that's the kind of progress that you want to make. That's the experiments that you want to take with this to see what you can get. So let's add a few more in. So if I select my model and I go back into my Insert Edge Loop tool by pressing Shift and right clicking, Insert Edge Loop tool, let me just add another one up on the top. And then I'll also do the same thing on the bottom. So we added a few new edge loops in down on the bottom here. We'll see what that does. And then I'm also going to go do something similar kind of in this other area that I talked about. I might want to try and kind of firm up a little bit. So I'm going to add an edge loop that goes around here and here. And then I'll do the same right underneath that border too. Right there and then right above it on the top. So as far as the top went, if I go into my edge mode, I'll show you. I added in this one, this one, this one, and this one. So those 4 edge loops that are orange are what I just added in, and we'll see what kind of change those make. And then on the bottom, I added in a few extras as well. I added this one, and I added this one. So I just added 6 new edge loops, so that's 10 in total now that we've added into this model. It's still pretty low poly, like extremely low poly, but it should be able to keep its form a little bit better. So let's just test this out and see what it looks like. So if I click 3, you can start to see that shape compared to what we had before. So what we're seeing, and if I turn my wireframe on shaded off, you can kind of see it a little bit better actually. You can see that this new model here, number 2, so I'm going to call this edge loops, really keeps its form compared to our base model. Our base model is extremely rounded out in these corners. Our new model has really kept that shape. It looks pretty good. And then on the top of, if this were a pawn, like for chess, our original model just kind of all blended together. It didn't have any definition. In our newest model, really does, right? It has this new border that's kind of built in. You can see it right here, and it looks pretty good. And if we just kind of take a look at the poly count on this, it's still really low. So that's a really clean model that you guys could use. And just by making 10 new edge loops onto this thing, we've been able to keep its form, to keep this box look, and still have a model that looks pretty good, and would easily be able to be worked around as far as texturing and everything else goes because it's super low poly still. All right, so let's see what other changes we can make to it to just get a different look. So I'm going to take this second, my edge loops model, and I'm going to duplicate that. And I'm going to click W and I'm going to pull it off to the side. And I'm going to rename this one Crease Tool. So Maya has what's called a Crease Tool. To be honest with you, I don't use it very often because I can usually get the look that I need just with the edge loops in general. But I did think it's important to at least mention it for you. So we'll talk about the Crease Tool real quick. So what that'll do, if I select my new model here and I go into my edge mode, right click and go to edge, I want to go through and I want to crease some of these edges. So I'm going to select certain edge loops. I'm going to select these ones kind of coming up. So if I just double click on this edge here, you'll see it'll do this top edge loop right there. I'm going to do all 4 of those going around this model. And then, since we have already worked on this top part a little bit, why don't we select those as well? So I'll just select the middle one for each, and we'll crease that. And we'll just see what kind of difference it makes. It might not make a huge difference, but we'll find out. So I selected the 4 coming up on all sides, and then just those original edge loops that were built in before I added extra kind of wrapping around them. With those selected, I want to hold down Shift, right click, and scroll down till I get to my Crease Tool. With Crease Tool selected, what you need to do is middle mouse click and just drag to your right. You can drag to your right and it'll kind of almost look like these edges are bold now. It's creasing them. Or you can go to your left, and if you just go to your left, that's going to keep us where we were. If you go to your right, it's going to make them look bold, and then you can just kind of let go. So if I go back to my object mode now, what you'll see is that these edges are creased, right? They're still just one vertice. That hasn't changed. All that's changed is that the edges look a little bit different. So what does that actually do? Well, let's find out. So if I were to smooth all of these back out, let's see if it really makes a difference. Let me turn my wireframe on shaded off. And now, if we were to kind of go in and look at this, you need to remember the couple areas that we used, right? So the bottom, we didn't actually do anything to. But we added that crease in down this edge right here and then around this top base. So let's see if those look any different. And if you're just looking at it, it really does look like it made an impact, right? So this coming down, this edge right here, looks like it has a lot more definition than what we had on our second model and definitely our first model without adding any more edge loops in. We used the crease tool. It just kind of changed how that edge was going to react to being smoothed out. And now it has kept its shape a little bit better. As far as the top goes, we had already added in those edge loops and gotten a pretty defined look on that second model. But with this new crease tool added on top of that, we've got a model that's really kept that kind of sharp edge, that sharp border. And you can really see it if we look at it from the top, right? So if we just look at the top views, there we go, you can see how rounded out our original model was. Our second model was pretty rounded out, even though it looked like it was pretty well defined. And our newest model has really kept its shape up on top. It's still got that cube look to it, but at the same time, it is smoothed out, which is nice. So that's a great option for you to use the crease tool in certain situations where it might come into handy. You never really know. For whatever reason, I don't use it very often myself, but I probably should, because just kind of looking at the results as far as what we can see compared to some of our previous models, it makes a huge impact, and we didn't add in any edge loops between model number 2 and 3 here. All that we did was crease those edges, and it made that big of an impact. Okay, so let's talk about one more option. So I'm going to select my edge loops model, duplicate that, and pull that off to the side. So the next option that I want to talk about is actually using the smooth tool in Maya. So we've been clicking 3, and that gives you this smooth preview, right? And that's going to show you what this will look like. But you can still smooth things out in Maya and keep this shape, and it'll add in some new subdivisions and edge loops and things like that. But that's okay, because we'll still be somewhat low poly. So I've got a model that I generally like. It looks pretty good. I can click 3. I like what that preview looks like, but I do want it to be actually smoothed out for when I start my renders. If I select it and I go to Mesh, about halfway down you'll see Smooth. If you just click Smooth, you'll notice that it's going to add new subdivisions in. So it's going to break your model up. This is going to multiply it by 1. If I select subdivisions and scroll to the right, I can multiply it by 2 or 3. And I could go on, but I don't want to clog Maya up and explode it, which I may have just done. Okay, I'm safe. Or you can go back down to 0. So this is what we originally looked like. If I go to 1, you'll see the change. If I go to 2, you'll see the change there as well. So it makes some big changes, right? And it adds all these new subdivisions into your model, and that might be okay, depending on how high poly it already was. For a pretty low poly model, if we were to actually be rendering this out and we had a texture on it and it looked good, there's probably no reason that we couldn't bump it up to, a 1, potentially a 2, depending on how much else is going on in our scene and how important this model really was, but at least a 1. And this still isn't too bad, right? Like, there's a good amount of subdivisions in there now, but it's not anything completely crazy. And you'll notice that it just has a nicer look to it. It just it looks a little bit cleaner. If I were to go back and press 1, you'll see that just generally it has a cleaner look to it because it's got nice subdivisions that Maya has helped us generate. So the smooth tool is another option. It's not really going to change the look of what your model's gonna have compared to like the crease tool or adding all these other edge loops in. What it is going to do is just going to add those subdivisions so that you're able to keep that smooth look, even in a standard view. So I wanted to at least introduce it there as well. Whether or not you want to use a smooth tool, completely up to you. Using the smooth preview, depending on which rendering engine you're going to use, might be okay. But if you want to add some new subdivisions in and just keep things a little bit cleaner, then you can just use the smooth tool, go up to 1 or 2 or 3 potentially for your subdivisions, see how many new layers that adds in, new faces it adds into your scene. and decide if that's a good thing or not. But play around with those. I think that that's important. If you try and do some hard surface modeling, if you're modeling a chair like we'll be looking at eventually during these lessons, it's important to be able to keep that shape, right? If you have a wooden leg on your chair or a seat, you want to be able to keep it looking like wood. You don't want it to be completely rounded out. So using a crease tool or adding in some of those extra subdivisions are going to make a huge difference for you. So take advantage of it, play around with it so you start to get used to it. And as you do it more often, it'll really just start to make more sense for you.